Hello and welcome. I'm Sean Metcalf, and this is Security Weekly. Today and this morning, we are joined by Mickey Bresman, CEO of Semperis. And I'm very happy to have you here and be able to talk with you, Mickey. We've certainly known each other for years and have talked about the great success that you've had with Semperis. And one of the things that we've talked about in the past was Semperis and your focus on really helping to move organizations forward and solve the problems that a lot of organizations tend to have. I have a few questions for you, and I think I'd like to start with why do or should organizations modernize their Active Directory environment, and really what does that mean from your perspective?
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Great to see you as always, and great to be here. Thank you all for joining. It's a great question. I think if you think about the history, and I know that you know it probably better than anybody else, but AD has been around, roughly speaking, from 99, which makes it about 24 years old technology at this stage. And it also means that the system has been in place for about 24 years. Multiple different people used to be administrating that system, making changes, setting up policies, rules, and so on, coming and going from the organization. The organization itself changed. If you think about the time where AD actually came out, virtualization wasn't even a thing yet. Cloud was not a thing yet. Working remotely was kind of, but not really a thing yet, right? All of the things that we today take completely for granted. So if you think about all of that, that means there is some technical debt that was gathered over the years. There is also misconfigurations that were happening because it was different times, different needs. We were all behind firewalls, closed environments, and so on. My main point here, it's no longer the same environment, and you also don't know how the environment has been changing, by whom, and for what reasons. So you find yourself in this situation where you have a critical system that have been modified multiple times by different people for different reasons. And the question that comes to mind is this is now ready for the new enterprise, for the new and modern enterprise. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is the answer in most cases is not, because we're seeing that in, I think, pretty much every one that you will be quoting will say that 9 out of 10 attacks will have a D right in the middle of it. It's a target, but outside of the fact it's a target, it's actually a sensitive target. So once you get in, as you know, you get the keys to the kingdom and so on. And that's, from my perspective, is the main reasons why companies should take a deep look into their AD environments and adjust it to the new environment that we're living in.
Oh, you make a good point about Active Directory being, well, very old. I don't think many people have a car that is 24 years old at this point. And so when you think about it from that perspective and the technology perspective, the systems and networks weren't even connected to the internet when Active Directory came out, to your point, no cloud. And these things have changed a lot, and with these misconfigurations, as you mentioned, and sort of vulnerabilities that have been just kind of layered over time in Active Directory, how do cyber attackers actually take advantage of those things, and what are the things you think that are maybe the solutions or the right path forward to kind of tighten that up?
That's a great question. And yes, you're absolutely right. AD has been not created with the thinking of the current state of events. But I always also remind people that it's not that AD by itself is insecure. You can tighten up and you can defend it, and it's definitely a system that can continue and serve organizations for a very long time. With that said, you do need to figure out how the attackers are abusing the environment and then act accordingly to close the gaps. That can mean scanning the AD environment and look for known vulnerabilities. That can be look for misconfigurations. There are multiple common examples of things that people just don't always think about. I'll give you a very simple one. In many companies, especially the more advanced ones, this is going to be a bit surprising, you have a dedicated team that is responsible for creating servers, setting those up. Now, as part of that, you might have the same team joining the machine to a domain, which is a very straightforward activity. Then that machine is being provided to the AD team, as an example. Now, if the AD team just provisioned the machine to become a DC at this stage, you can already guess where I'm going with it, it's going to mean that the actual account of the machine is still owned by the team that set it up from the get-go. So it's a simple example of a very thoughtful, right process to follow with a small misconfigurational step along the way. And that leads, of course, to misconfiguration. So those kind of things are the things that we're seeing a lot. Another thing that I think is a common scenario that we're seeing is companies merge, if it's through acquisition or whatever that was the scenario that happened. And very quickly you want to get to a point where you can actually have both of those new organizations operate as close to being one as possible. That means that you want them to use the same resources, have the same access policies, and so on. But unfortunately, when you acquire a company, you will not necessarily know what is it that you're getting. And in many cases, it might be that even if you are doing an amazing job and you have hardened your environment, prepared yourself, you're ready for whatever it's coming, this new company that you acquired were not as educated as you, let's call it this way. And if you were just to absorb them in by creating an AD trust as an example, then all of a sudden you just created a beachhead that can be used by an attacker to breach a less secured environment and get to your more secured environment. So those are the kind of things that I suggest to people to think about.
So this example that you use around this acquisition, and you're bringing in something, it's almost like a mystery box that you buy, but its mystery box never really has anything good. It's not going to be a pleasant surprise for the organization, because oftentimes when they're acquiring another company, like you said, they're picking up whatever is there, whatever is available, however they've been managing things. And I really like your example of the server admins and this process. And certainly history of process, these processes were probably developed potentially in the early 2000s or even in 2010s, and things have changed quite a bit since then. And certainly when we talk about these outdated AD environments, it's great that you bring up the process, because we often think about the technology, right? This technology that is Active Directory that is 24 years old, and now we're going to cloud. How do you see these kind of risks and challenges of the outdated AD environments, not just for obviously from a technology standpoint, but what are some of the challenges around that, and where do you see that going?
That's a great question. And I think that there's definitely a lot of challenges that we're seeing in this regard, because as you start to adopt new technologies, like cloud as an example, all of a sudden you open yourself up to the wide, wild web. And that's something to consider, because all of a sudden you're no longer behind your own closed wall and so on. I think there are definitely multiple challenges, but as I mentioned, you definitely can solve all of those. So it's just a matter of putting the right processes in place. And I'm a very strong believer of people, technology, process. It's not going to be any one of those in silo. You're going to need to basically work on all of those. So I think it's, first of all, figuring out if the processes that you have, are those still relevant to what you're trying to achieve. In many cases, it might mean that maybe you have your own specialty in AD in your own team, and you can do it with them. Maybe you need to bring in a third party to look into your AD environment and figure out what do we need to change. I always also suggest to customers to start with the thinking of what is the outcome? What is it we're looking to achieve? If we have, as an example, we want to have a resiliency in our company, in our organization. Okay, what does it mean? What is the SLA time? What is the recovery point in time that you want to be able to get to? What happens in the worst case scenario? So kind of walk yourself back from the end result, and that will kind of guide you in terms of what you want to achieve. Then some of the other things that you want to think about is what kind of a compensating controls do you want to have in place if there are some additional risk that you need to bring into the organization, because at the end of the day, we should be enabling the business. This is kind of the number one priority.
And I think that's a part that often gets forgotten about, is enabling the business. If security is always saying no, then what value does security bring to the business? You mentioned process and outdated process. The thing that always comes to mind for me, especially with ransomware being on everyone's mind, I think, is the process of Active Directory backup and recovery, or even backup and recovery in the organization at large. How do you see that evolving, or has it evolved? Have companies really taken and adjusted their process from where it was maybe 20 years ago, or are they still using the same old system and methodology? What are your thoughts around that?
So I think that the awareness around it have changed a lot, and I think that from that perspective, we definitely see companies taking these next steps. I think also in the analyst community, which is quite interesting to me to see, because I've been kind of looking at kind of as you for many, many years. I've just read yesterday one of the latest Gartner reports on ITDR, and they have the system where they rank how much impact will something have on your company. ITDR, which stands for Identity Threat Detection and Response, is now ranked as the highest priority that you can in terms of the impact that you will get, for the obvious reasons, right? Because you need this compensating control to cover your AD environment. With that said, according to Gartner, that's also interesting, only 5 to 20% of the companies out there have already adopted solutions to help them with that challenge. That means to me that there is about 80% of the companies that still are not 100% there, let's go this way. I do see a quick adoption, and I do see a quick understanding from the company side that we're being attacked. I think to some degree, I have sometimes those conversations with CISOs, and many of them are at the current state of if we can hold the status quo, it's actually going to be fine. Now, this might seem a bit surprising because they're not trying necessarily to improve things, but what kind of you need to keep in the back of your head is that the amount of attacks and the sophistication of attacks is much, much higher. So if you can keep those at bay, you're actually improving. That's another way to look at it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So what do you see as keys to success, or really the direction that organizations could go in when it comes to successfully modernizing their Active Directory environment, or even in a situation where they may need to do a migration in order to consolidate some of those environments that they have out there? Because certainly, as you mentioned, when companies are acquiring all these other companies, they end up with a mess of Active Directory forests. I'm just going to quote that now and say, you have when multiple Active Directory forests, it's a mess. Kind of like a flock of birds. So
yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, Mickey?
So I think I'm going to use the same metaphor that you used. I'm going to say, don't get yourself into a position that you get a surprise box, because it's not going to be pretty. What we typically suggest is a very organized method of how to approach it. First thing, make sure that you understand what you have. Scan that environment. Before you connect anything to your environment, make sure that that environment is secured, or at least at the level that you feel comfortable enough with. So ideally, you want to scan that environment, you want to look for misconfigurations, you want to look for vulnerabilities, you want to understand maybe this environment has already been compromised. So you want to make sure that at the very least, you made sure that you're not connecting yourself to a compromised environment for the obvious reasons. Next step that you probably will want to do as part of the migration process that you're going to go through is to map out the critical and sensitive accounts in the environment from which you're bringing in the accounts. Part of the thinking is that if you were able to map out which accounts are sensitive, privileged accounts as an example, when those are being transitioned now to the new environment, they should probably go to the same, I'm going to call those OUs for the sake of the discussion, or whatever other policies you have in place, because you want to make sure that they're treated in the same way as you're treating your privileged accounts. One of the things that I've seen in some of those activities that were not necessarily the best way to approach things is transitioning everything in the same way, which leads to the fact that all of a sudden you have a privileged account that is outside of the policies of what you would typically have for those. So that's also should be part of the process. Then I will also say that if you can, avoid setting trust between environments. If you have the ability to migrate those entities, users, objects, whatever the case might be, without setting in trust, this is definitely going to be the right way to approach it. Some of the other things that we always suggest to people to think about, you're going to need some sort of a safety net, because if something goes wrong, sometimes things go wrong, what to do, right? You don't want to be in a position there is nothing you can do, so you want to be able to revert back. You probably want to test it as well. So if you can create a copy of your production environment on both sides and then test your migration plan, that's probably the ideal scenario. The next thing that you also want to think about, this one is easier to explain by an example. So back in 2012, I think, I was doing a migration project of AD. And we got to a point where we migrated a user object from environment A into forest B. The object migrates, but for some reason, out of the, let's say, 30 attributes that were populated on the original side, only 20 show up. So for some reason, we can't migrate those other 10 attributes, and we go crazy trying to understand why those 10 specifically are not migrating. Long story short, after a few days, we realized that the problem was not the migration. It was migrating. There was a policy on the other side that was taking those attributes and clearing those. But we spend a lot of time trying to understand what is causing it. My point there is that you want to have visibility into how your migration process looks like and what's happening actually in reality. So you want something that can say on both sides, is this object being modified by something? If yes, by what? Because that can answer the question of why. So to summarize it all, you want to have vulnerability scanning and understanding of the potential vulnerabilities that you might be exposing your organization to, and ideally you want to fix those ahead of time. You want to have a safety net. So if something goes wrong, you have the ability to bounce back. You want to test your migration in a production-like environment as close as possible, ideally the exact production. And you want to have as much visibility as possible into what is actually happening during the migration process.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Mickey. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. So this is Sean Metcalf with Security Weekly. Please visit securityweekly.com/SemperisBH to learn more about Semperis, apologies, Mickey. And we will be back with more interviews. Thank you very much for joining us.